Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of the 100 Days of Growth. Today we are going to be looking at a very interesting topic. Some of the behaviors of JavaScript on how it handles comparison. So we're going to be looking at the double or the triple comparison check. So I'm going to start with a very practical example. You know, we both know that the double equation checks for value and the triple equation checks for value and type. But what we also do not see many times, is how the double equation actually does the comparison. For instance, when we compare the string 0 and true, right? What is this going to give us? Is this going to give us true or false? This is actually going to give us false. Why? Because the double equation first tries to merge the type. So this is actually not, like an actual kind of comparison, right? Because what is actually compared to true or false is a number, not a string, right? So it first of all tries to it strips up the string and converts it to a number, 0, and it compares, is 0 true? Actually it's going to be false, because 0 is always false. If we check this in our console, you see it. And it's also the same thing when we try to compare the string of 1 and true, right? So it's going to strip off the number and 1 automatically becomes true. So if you check it, 1 is true. And it's the same thing when we do the inverse. So when we do string of 0 equal to false, we're going to get true. String of 1 equal to false, we're going to also get false. Why? Because it first of all strips off the value and tries to do a comparison. Another very tricky part of comparison is when we use local storage. So let's say we have a value, signed up for newsletter, and the user actually signed up for newsletter, which is true. And then we store it in local storage dot set item, and then we say this is newsletter. Let's call this newsletter. What do we call this? Let's call this signed up, right? Let's call this signed up. So we are now going to store the signed up for newsletter. Now when we are fetching this value, const newsletter check, so we want to check if the user signed up for newsletter, and then we can say local storage dot get item signed up. Now if we console log newsletter check, because the local storage does not store boolean, it stores JSON, and every JSON item is treated like a string. If we check this in our console now, you should see that we get a string of true. Now notice this is white, this is not a boolean. If we add the type of check, you should see that this is a string, right? This is a string and not a boolean. So now this is where most people get it wrong, where they try to now check, oh, if newsletter check, right, send newsletter, right? So they try to send newsletter, else console log, do not send, right? Or maybe you may not even add an else, but I want to add an else here to show us what happens, because the string of true is, so if you console log this, it's going to give you send newsletter. Why? Because the string of true would always evaluate to true, but the string of true and string of 1, just like we saw here, would always evaluate to true. Any other thing aside from that is not going to evaluate to true. That's why we got send newsletter here. Why? Because the string of true, when you check it against true, so when you try to say console log string of true equal to true, it's always going to evaluate to true. But now this is also very tricky, because it does not always apply. So it always evaluates to it most likely evaluates to buggy code. For instance, if we try to check this now, so we're trying to see console on line 12, console on line 14, console on line 16. So take note of it. So you see console on line 12 evaluates to false, right? But console on line 14 evaluates to true. So string of true here did not evaluate to true, but string of newsletter check evaluated to true. So you see where it becomes very, 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 very tricky, right? Because the if block here is only supposed to run if it is true. Now, what the string of true is saying here, this can be a very tricky check, right? It can sometimes, this comparison check could be checking for, does it have a value, right? Now, does it have a value? So this if newsletter check could be checking for dot length, right? It could also be checking for, does it exist, is it null, is it not null. Now this could be some of the reasons, or these are some of the reasons why this evaluates to true. But trying to compare the string of true to true directly evaluates to false. Now another practical example where we are going to see this is with users inputs. So in a JavaScript, in a form, maybe you have a form equal to documents dot query selector, and then you, let's say you pick your form, you have a class of form, and you try to store the value, and then you say form dot something like form dot value, and or no, we could say something like form dot add event listener, and then on submit, right? On submit, let's do a real implementation, and then maybe we could pass the event object, and then you either prevent default. So here now we say, okay, we want to store the cons dot value equal to target dot value, right? Want to store the value of the form. Now if we can now say if value, right? Now this is a very, very tricky check. Why? Because let's assume this value is supposed to be age, right? Now there are quite a number of things we need to be very, very considerate of. One, we may want to do validation. The validation could be, is it, is the value a number, right? Is the value a number? Is it empty, right? Is it empty, right? Is it negative? Yes, this is also a very good a very, very good validation we want to check. Because if we just go ahead and check directly and say, okay, if it is a number, now we are going to have some very, very faulty check. So we can say something like, okay, if value is greater than or equal to 18, right? If value is greater than or equal to 18, and let's assume the value here was 10, let's see what we get. Okay, user is above 18, right? Now if we do this, right, for a string of 10, we are going to get a wrong we're going to get a wrong, or should I say a buggy response. Why? Because we are first supposed to strip off, we're first supposed to handle like a validation to be sure, okay, does this value exist? So instead of just going ahead to do a comparison like this, what we should do is, if value and number, like this, right? So we have to convert this also, right? Number greater than or equal to 18. This way we know that our response is always going to be certain, just like we saw this buggy behavior here, the difference between this and this, right? So these are some of the issues that working with double comparison check comes with, and triple comparison check also comes with. So you need to understand the difference between how they handle comparison and how you should also pass your values to be sure that you are using the right type of comparison checks for each of them. Now, this is like a quick check you can always pay attention to. If you pass in empty string, or empty string is always going to evaluate, empty string equal to true is always going to evaluate to false. We can confirm that here when we say empty string equal to true, right? Empty string equal to true is always going, this is not going to run because we don't actually have a form. So I actually just did this intentionally. This is always going to evaluate to false, right? Why? Because empty string technically is 0, right? So it's always going to evaluate to false if you're comparing it to true. We also said another rule of thumb is that string, if you use a string of 1, is stripped off to 1. So never forget that, right? Equal to true would always this will always evaluate to false. This would always evaluate to true, and this would also always evaluate to false, right? So basically these are like some of the rules you must always follow. Now, it's always good to start with the triple check. Why should you always start with the triple? We should always use the triple check. Why? Because it compares type and value. It doesn't have all of this buggy behavior. You are sure that the only time when you may want to use the double check is when you are console logging null equal to undefined, which is always going to evaluate to true, right? Number 40. And this is a special case with JavaScript, right? Now, if this is not the case, you should never use the double check or the double equation, because it's always going to mess with your code. There is a very, very high and likely probability that you're going to run into bugs, you're going to run into error. So I believe you've been able to learn something today, the difference between double and triple comparison check, why you should not use the double comparison check, how it handles comparison behind the scenes by first of all trying to ensure that the both values are the same. So it strips off the string if it's a string conversion, or it tries to convert it to the same type before it converts it. And I believe you were able to learn something. If you did, you can drop something in the comments. If you're yet to follow, to subscribe to my channel, do well to subscribe. Turn on your notification button so that you can always get notified whenever I drop a new video. Like and share this so that you can, pass this message to as many of your friends as possible. Thank you for joining me, and yeah, see you tomorrow. Bye.